best to make this real.
Yeah, cities changing dramatically and will change dramatically, of course, because of the pandemic. If you have a look online for Stefano Boeri, you can see his vertical forest, these rather extraordinary tower blocks covered with vegetation aimed to help the planet, and they look pretty striking too. And also you can see these primrose pavilions, these places where people are going to get vaccinated, that symbol of hope and rebirth he was talking about as vaccinations potentially change our world in 2021.
Yeah, let's hope so. What an amazing story. What an amazing guy, actually, to hear that. And it was interesting to hear about the flowers and political parties. I know you spend a lot of time in Africa. In India as well, symbols still so important for political parties as literacy continues to increase.
Yeah, put your mark by the flower.
Yeah. What flower would you have? You look like a rose, man. Tulips, man.
Flatter.
This is the BBC World Service, looking at climate change.
A climate study endorsed by 11,000 scientists warns there'll be
How do we deal with the challenge of climate change?
Each week, we'll talk to our journalists on the ground and hear how the crisis is unfolding before their eyes.
And we'll be bringing together leading experts to hear how we might make a better future.
Join Neil Rozelle and Greer Jackson for The Climate Question, Monday at 9:20 GMT. And at 8:30 GMT, Business Daily.
We'll be asking how millennials are planning for their financial futures in one of the toughest economic periods since the financial crisis. Are the harsh realities of job insecurity and expensive housing creating a generation of fiscally aware younger people?
Now we return to Newsday here on the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
It's 6 o'clock in London on New Year's Eve. Hello and welcome to Newsday on the BBC World Service with James Cocknell and Rahul Tony.
A record number of COVID deaths, the new vaccine and the final arrival of Brexit. Our UK correspondent will be taking us through what's been a tumultuous 24 hours for Britain.
It really has. It's been quite a year in the US too, and plenty of changes to come. We'll hear what President-elect Joe Biden's first 100 days might look like, and a top Democratic strategist takes us down the path he believes Mr. Biden should follow.
Now we'll head north of the border too, to Canada, to hear about the man nicknamed Teflon Trudeau and how the Prime Minister has bounced back after a succession of scandals.
Also, the boss of Snapchat tells us what he thinks the future holds for social media and technology, not just in 2021, but a longer-term future as well. That's all coming up after the very latest BBC World News.
BBC News. Hello, I'm Tom Watts. The Chinese authorities have given conditional approval for public use for a coronavirus vaccine developed by the state-owned drug maker Sinopharm. It's the first official backing for any of the Chinese-made vaccines undergoing clinical trials. Warren Bull reports.
China's pharmaceutical industry has been slower to develop approved vaccines for COVID-19 than some government-backed giants in Europe and the US, for example. But mass inoculation has been taking place in China for months, using vaccines at a late trial stage. In July, Beijing approved 3 different jabs for emergency use in key workers and other people at high risk. By the end of November, 1.5 million doses of vaccine had been administered. Sinopharm says its jab has 79% effectiveness.
The United States has set a new record for the number of coronavirus deaths registered in a single day, more than 3,900. The figure for the past 24 hours was released by Johns Hopkins University. The Joint African Union and United Nations peacekeeping mission in the Sudanese region of Darfur comes to an end today after 13 years. Troops were deployed to protect civilians after mostly non-Arab communities rebelled against the government in Khartoum. Security forces were accused of committing genocide. Catherine Biara-Hanger has this report.
At the start of the new year, peacekeepers in Darfur will no longer patrol the region, protect displaced people's camps, or help deliver aid. The force of nearly 4,500 people now has 6 months to pack up its assets and leave. At one point, UNAMID, as it's called, was the largest peacekeeping mission in the world, but it's been criticized for not doing enough to protect civilians. Darfur is much safer today, with some attacks on civilians. Most of the rebel groups in the region signed a new peace deal with the government in October.
Officials in Sydney, Australia, have warned against what they call coronavirus super-spreading events on New Year's Eve in New South Wales, which has recorded a further 10 cases of COVID-19. Here's Shaima Khalil.
Australia's largest city will mark New Year's Eve with pared-down celebrations amid a further tightening of restrictions. This year's fireworks display will run for approximately 7 minutes instead of its usual 12, and crowd numbers will be limited in areas that typically would draw thousands of viewers to prevent the spread of COVID-19. The city precinct will be restricted to those with restaurant, cafe, and hotel bookings, while prime harbourside viewing spots will be set aside for health workers. Households will now be limited to only 5 guests, and outdoor gatherings have been cut to 30.
World news from the BBC. The German leader Angela Merkel has used her final New Year's address to the nation to say that 2020 has been her most difficult year as Chancellor. In a rare show of emotion, Mrs. Merkel criticised people who had refused to follow rules and had advanced conspiracy theories about the coronavirus. She described them as cynical and cruel towards those who had suffered. The US Justice Department has accused a prominent Ukrainian tycoon, Ihor Kolomoisky, and another businessman from Ukraine of using fraudulent funds to buy property in the state of Ohio. The Justice Department's statement said it was seeking to forfeit the property bought by the two men in Ohio with funds embezzled from Privatbank in Ukraine. It said Mr. Kolomoisky and Gennady Bologoykov defrauded the bank of billions of dollars. There have been similar allegations against Mr. Kolomoisky in the states of Kentucky and Texas. The United States says it's imposing new trade tariffs on France and Germany weeks before a new administration takes over in Washington. Jonathan Josephs reports.
With less than 3 weeks still in office, the Trump administration has once again turned to tariffs. New import taxes are being imposed on non-sparkling wines, as well as brandies and aircraft manufacturing parts from France and Germany. The US says it's doing so because the European Union unfairly used figures from during the coronavirus pandemic to calculate which products it would impose tariffs on. It also unfairly excluded UK trade. This means more US products were hit than would otherwise have been the case.
Russian experts say a recently unearthed woolly rhinoceros is one of the best examples of an Ice Age animal yet discovered in Siberia. The rhino was revealed by the melting permafrost in the Yakutia region in northeastern Russia. Scientists were surprised to learn the animal's internal organs were mostly intact. Scientists in Yakutsk will take samples to carry out radiocarbon analysis.
Thank you for that news and welcome to Newsday with Rahul and James. In the next half hour, we'll chart a possible path for Joe Biden's first 100 days in office in the US. We'll look much further ahead with the founder of Snapchat, and we'll hear how Canada's Prime Minister has bounced back from a number of scandals. Remember, you can text us or send us a WhatsApp message on anything you hear. Our number is +44 7786 20 50 85.
But let's start here in the UK because it may be the festive season, but there's been no chance to put up your feet if you're a cabinet minister. Millions more people are now under severe coronavirus restrictions. A further new vaccine has been given the green light for use, and the final seal of approval to a post-Brexit deal with the European Union has been agreed. So it's been an eventful 24 hours. It's been a busy 2020 for our UK affairs correspondent, Rob Watson. He's probably going to have a busy 2021 as well. Rob, lots to talk about. Let's start with that Oxford vaccine. It's good news finally, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Hi, Rahul. Hi, James. And very nearby me, of course, I'm speaking to you from Oxford, and indeed one of my school friends, his wife was part of the project. So I can tell you actually that lots of scientists in Oxford gave up their normal jobs to work on this. But there is a lot of optimism around it, partly because it's just easier to store, easier to transport, and cheaper than some of the other vaccines already available. So there's no doubt, I think, that the UK government and presumably fairly soon others will think of this as the silver bullet to end this nightmare of a pandemic.
Very much so. And I think it's news that people around the world have been following very closely. As happened throughout this year, good news is quickly followed by some bad news. And many parts of the UK this morning waking up to being in Tier 4 and kids not returning to school. Maybe not bad news for kids, not great news for parents.
No, I was just looking at the figures, Rahul. So 78% of the population of England, that's about 44 million people, are now living under this Tier 4 arrangement, which is, it's a lockdown in any other name, Rahul, right? I mean, the government, Boris Johnson doesn't like the idea of lockdowns because the sort of libertarian right of the governing Conservative Party hates it, but it is a lockdown. And yeah, there are 44 million of us who are only supposed to go to essential shops and only go to work if you have to. And on the children front, I'm going to clear my throat here and deep sighs. So I happen to have two teenage kids who are. I think they were rather excited when they found out yesterday. Daddy, have you seen the news? Well, duh, I work in the news.
Yeah. My kids had a similar reaction.
So you know. But of course, it's look. While your kids and mine may think, aha, a couple more weeks at home. I mean, clearly, it's a major shock to the system because everybody has agreed that keeping children at home is just about the worst thing possible socially for their development, for the future of the country, and of course that it tends to discriminate against it tends to be even worse for the children of the less well off.
Very much so. Now, we can't have you on the programme and not talk about Brexit. Have you managed to go through that deal and make sense of exactly what it entails for this country?
I would not be foolish enough to say that I'd been through all, whatever it is, 1,300 pages. I've looked at the key bits, which have been highlighted by people who are paid money to do this kind of thing and are experts. And I think the really important thing for everybody listening to take away is that this is a radical departure. You know, Britain isn't sort of staying a little bit part of a member of the European Union. Absolutely not. What this deal does is it confirms Britain as leaving the single market, the customs union, the two main economic elements. It will have a much more distant relationship with the European Union economically. There will be all sorts of new checks and regulations. I think it's something like an estimated 200 million extra passport declarations. So it's going to be a very, very different relationship indeed.
Rob, thank you for all your reporting during 2020, and we look forward to hearing more of you in 2021.
We've got a text in on this, actually. Rahul, you and Rob were talking about. Amara Alf in Kailahun says it's welcoming news, timely and welcoming news, the discovery of the COVID-19 vaccine, but wants to know when Africans will receive their own one. And that issue of vaccine ethics and how it will get around the whole world is one we're going to be coming to a little bit later on in the programme. But we're going to move now to the US, and the Democrat President-elect Joe Biden and his vice presidential running mate, Kamala Harris, are to be sworn into office in January. So what can we expect from their first 100 days in office? I've been speaking to the Democratic strategist, Michael Gordon.
We're in the middle of several crises right now. First, of course, is the pandemic. Crisis number 2, which follows closely on the heels of that, is the economic crisis, the high level of joblessness that the country is experiencing, and job insecurity and economic insecurity as a result of the pandemic. Of course, the third, and certainly not third in terms of importance, but just third in order, is the racial reckoning in our country in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. I think for the first time in my lifetime, there will be real and systemic change as a result in terms of racial justice in this country.
Is that change going to come from Washington or not?
The big turning point, of course, is what happens in the Georgia Senate runoffs on January 5th. And there are 2 seats that are up. If the Democrats win both, they will have control of the Senate and the House and the White House.
It's a pretty big if, though, isn't it?
Yes, but it's possible. And so I'm hoping that will make the difference. It's going to be close, and it is an uphill battle, even with that to happen. But if they do win both seats, then the Democrats will control both Congress and the White House. and we'll have an opportunity for some very important legislation on racial justice and on other matters as well. If, of course, the Republicans just win one of the two seats, they will retain control of the Senate. Democrats will have the House, will have divided government. And certainly, as we've seen for the past, certainly during the Obama administration, the real unwillingness to give the Democratic president in the White House, any opportunity to move any legislation forward that's meaningful. And you've seen how the Republican Senate has kowtowed to Trump for 4 years. So I think it's not going to be too hard to predict how tough it will be for Biden to get legislation through the Senate with the Republican Senate. So those two Senate seats are really the crux of the next 2 years in Washington.
America seems as divided politically, dare I say it, culturally, as it has been for many, many years. Is that something you think will diminish once President Trump leaves the White House, or is that really one of the great battles of the next few years?
There are two things that have been growing in importance and still growing in importance and have really amplified and mirrored the division in our country, and that is cable news and, number two, social media. And so it becomes harder to even hear or consider the other side, to consider that the other side might have a point, to consider that the other side might have something useful to say or there's some common ground. And so those things aren't going to be changing anytime soon. In fact, they'll only probably be getting more significant. So what we need is leadership across Washington to help make a difference and to help bridge and heal the country. I think Biden is going to make a real effort to do that, but he's going to need help from other Democrats and Republicans, and I'm not sure he's going to get a lot of it.
That's the Democrat strategist Michael Gordon with his thoughts on what's ahead for Joe Biden and his team.
Yeah, we will, of course, follow that here on Newsday. A reminder of our main headlines. This morning, China has approved its first coronavirus vaccine for general use, and the United Nations is ending its peacekeeping mission in the Sudanese region of Darfur.
And let's get the sports headlines now with James Craig.
Liverpool will be going into the new year 3 points clear of Manchester United at the top of the English Premier League, having played a game more as well, though. That follows a goalless draw at Newcastle last night. Liverpool failed to score, and it was the first time that has happened in the Premier League this season. There was meant to be another game taking place as well last night, Fulham versus Tottenham. That is the third game to be postponed this month because of positive coronavirus tests. In La Liga, it's not Barcelona or Real at the top. It's Atletico who are going to end the year at the top of La Liga after beating Getafe last night. Luis Suarez with the only goal of the game there. And Becky Hammond became the first woman to direct an NBA team in a regular season game, taking over the San Antonio Spurs after their coach was ejected in a loss to the LA Lakers, who of course themselves are the reigning NBA champions. LeBron continues to break records. We'll be hearing more about that in 30 minutes' time here on Newsday.
Looking forward to that, James. Thank you.
Time now for our business news for the penultimate time this year. Andrew Wood joins us from his business desk in Hong Kong. And Andrew, you're going to talk about gender balance in some of the UK's largest companies.
Yeah, not just some of the UK, but some of the world's largest companies, namely the 350 biggest companies listed on the London Stock Exchange. So that includes, giant companies, say, like Unilever and so on. A couple of years ago, the UK government commissioned an independent review into the number of women directors on their boards. And it's called the Hamilton-Alexander Review. And joining us now is Denise Wilson, who's the chief executive of the Hampton and Alexander Review. Good morning to you. I believe today is an important deadline, isn't it? What's the target that's supposed to be achieved by today?
Good morning, Andrew. Yes, today marks the end of the 5-year period in which the FTSE 350 were tasked with a target of 33% women on their boards and in the leadership team immediately below the boards. So the drive to be getting more women onto boards began about 10 years ago. And 5 years ago, with the Hampton-Alexander Review, we increased that target, widened the scope to include the leadership team, so the senior 80 to 100 roles in any FTSE-listed company. The report will be published in February, but today is the deadline date for companies to have achieved that target. And whereas,
can you give us a clue as to whether they're going to or not? Can you give us an inside track on this?
So the FTSE 350 as a whole have met the 33% target in the aggregate. The FTSE 100 are slightly above that, around 35%. So that's good. But within that, there is quite some variance, and that is the data that we'll be publishing in our report in February on the leadership teams. Today, I can tell you a little bit about where we are on boards. FTSE 100, just over 70 of those companies have met the target. Some exceeded it significantly so, and those names include, as you mentioned earlier, Unilever, Diageo, Burberry, Taylor Wimpey, Lloyds Bank, BP, Vodafone, Standard Life, London Stock Exchange, BHP, and many, many more. But as I said, there is some variance, and there will be some companies that have missed the target both on boards and in leadership teams. And they include one or two big names as well, which is a surprise. There's a high street bank there, and global supermarket, food manufacturer, an insurance company. And I think, the question to ask yourself is, after 5 years, why are some companies, particularly some of those in what might be considered slightly easier sectors that attract more women and is easier to retain women, why are they still struggling?
Okay, well, let's hope we can talk to you again in February when the full report is out and you can give us some more details. So, Denise Wilson, Chief Executive of the Hampton Alexander Review, thanks for joining us on Newsday.
Andrew Wood there from Hong Kong, James, on some of the challenges that really need to be addressed in 2021.
Indeed. Now we're going to turn to Evan Spiegel. He's the tech boss and co-founder of the messaging app Snapchat, developed when he was still at university, who went on to become one of the youngest billionaires in the world when Snapchat was floated on the stock market. He's still only 30, and his product has more than 250 million daily users, most of them his age or considerably younger. The BBC's Michelle Hussein has been speaking to Mr. Spiegel and began by asking about the concepts he believes will shape America this century.
It's just such an interesting time to consider our future. We're entering this new era of global competition. You have the rise of Asia. By 2030, I think the largest economies will be China and the US and India. And this is not something the US has confronted before. And so we're at a very interesting moment where the US is considering its own internal politics and internal systems, and also being challenged globally in a way that's really new. And so starting to think about what that's going to look like for, our kids and their kids, I think is a really important conversation.
What do you think that long-term thinking should lead to?
A huge amount of our budget, at least at the federal level, goes to our social security system, goes to healthcare for folks, over the age of 65, and of course to our military. And so I think if you look today at America's spending patterns, a lot of them are oriented around the present and not so much around the future. And that actually is in contrast to some of the historical investments America has made. Really big projects like putting a man on the moon, which was a historical effort that was really a private and public partnership to make that possible, or even some of our big investments in R&D that have created things like GPS or lasers, or even the internet, which was really a government-funded research project.
But to be clear, in order to achieve better outcomes, would you be prepared to pay maybe many times more the tax that you do? And would you be prepared for Snapchat to do the same? Do you think the tech industry as a whole should be paying more corporate tax than it does at present?
Oh, happily, but remember, tax is only one part of the conversation. I think the other part of the conversation is where we invest that revenue to make sure that we can generate the necessary gains for our future. And I think it turns out when you invest in things like education and healthcare for young people, those investments are hugely profitable. And so this idea that you need to raise taxes and spend, it may be an oversimplification, because a lot of these profitable investments could actually be debt funded and return well in excess of the investment level required over the long term. But some of the things that actually restrict our ability to do that are things like the budget window. So when we're thinking about budgeting in America, we have a 10-year budget window. And so when you're thinking about a long-term investment like early childhood education, because we know young children who have access to early childhood education can outperform children that don't, but we really only see those gains over a really long time horizon. horizon. So, it's 30 years before they're really generating revenue for the government in the form of taxes.
You've clearly thought about all of these issues for some time. I wonder where that thinking comes from. And I ask that because you founded Snapchat when you were still at university at Stanford. You had incredible success while in your early 20s. You're still only just 30. Why? Why do all of this? Why think along these lines?
Well, the Snapchat community itself has really inspired us. I mean, we reach more than 70% of 13 to 34-year-olds in the United States, and they really care about the future. And very often they feel like their perspective is underrepresented in our government. You even look at the age of some of our, most senior politicians, they're 70 or 80 years old. So we're talking about 1 or 2 generations removed from the Snapchat community. And so I do think that it is important to have these conversations on behalf of our community who use our product every day and are using it to engage with the news and politics and with their friends and to have conversations about what their own future will look like.
The thoughts of Evan Spiegel, head of Snapchat, and he was talking to the BBC's Michelle Hussein.
Now, Donald Trump was repeatedly attacked for his handling of the coronavirus pandemic by his Democratic rival, Joe Biden, during the US presidential election campaign. But his neighbour to the north, Canada's Justin Trudeau, generally has been getting positive reviews for his leadership for the way in which he's dealt with the same problem. Seasoned political watchers say 2020 has been a relatively good year for the Canadian PM, bouncing back after numerous scandals. Jessica Murphy has this report from Toronto.
We are in an unprecedented global pandemic that really sucks.
Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has always scored well with voters on traits like empathy and compassion, and his public image has received a boost during the pandemic. He wasn't alone. A number of politicians around the world experienced a coronavirus polling bump. As Liberal commentator John Delacourt says, handling the pandemic played to his strengths.
Seeing the Prime Minister every day in the first months of this pandemic come out, speak to Canadians about the fiscal stimulus measures, about where the curve was going, all of that provided Canadians a sense of reassurance that perhaps the government necessarily did not have the answers, but it was working through the most effective response and listening to Canadians.
However, Trudeau didn't begin the year in such a strong position.
Trudeau. Canada's Ethics Commissioner has found the Prime Minister violated the Conflict of Interest Act and that
At the end of 2019, after a year marked by scandal, he won re-election, though he ended up with a minority government. His victory was achieved with around 1/3 of the popular vote. It was one of the lowest ever shares in Canadian history for a governing party.
So when you think about the first 3 months of the year, he's sort of reeling from being chastised out of the 2019 election. He's trying to figure out how to get back on track. It's not really going that well.
Conservative political strategist Jason Leader described this year's politics as BC and AC, before COVID and after COVID.
If you're Mr. Trudeau, you're actually politically in a better place at the end of this year than you were at the beginning of the year, mostly because you're generally judged to have had a competent handling of the pandemic. So it's been an interesting year, but I think it's before March and after March are two completely different places.
These Torontonians say for the most part, they've been impressed with Trudeau's response.
I'm impressed with how he's been doing it. It's brand new. Nobody's had one before. When you compare us to other countries similar to us, Britain, United States, we're far ahead of them. This thing has really moved him up a huge notch, I think.
I think Trudeau's done a really good job. This is not easy for the world, never mind Canada, but he's been really good. He got into action quickly. He's been listening to the doctors and the scientists.
Has his handling of the pandemic changed your opinion on him in any way?
Probably yes, because I wouldn't want to be in his shoes. I mean, other stuff he's done, I don't agree with, but I think so. I feel for him, definitely.
A summer ethics controversy knocked his government off course for a couple of months.
I made a mistake in not recusing myself immediately from the discussions, given our family's history. And I'm sincerely sorry about not having done that.
The political scandal over a pandemic stimulus contract going to a charity with ties to his family cost him his longtime finance minister. And, according to pollster Sachi Curl, Canadians took notice.
One doesn't like to equate a worsening health crisis that is taking the lives of people and throwing other lives into chaos as a reason to see your political fortunes rise, but that was what happened. And the WE scandal was so resonant with Canadians because it reminded them here in this country of just how mad they can get at Justin Trudeau for doing things that tick them off.
By September, Canadians and Trudeau had other concerns. COVID cases were rising alarmingly in parts of the country.
So the Canadian Prime Minister is not just warning of a second wave of virus, he says it has already arrived. Infections in Canada.
Now vaccines offer the possibility of hope and politics as usual, but Justin Trudeau can't always rely on a COVID bounce. Jason Leader again.
If you're having an election 2 years out, I think you're starting to think about some of that scar tissue that's built up. This guy's built up more scar tissue in 5 years than most prime ministers build up in 10.
That vulnerability is underscored by leading a minority government. And the NDP, the left-leaning New Democratic Party led by Jagmeet Singh, has recently helped prop up Trudeau's Liberal minority.
People need help right now. They need confidence in the future. They're not looking for an election.
That helped prevent a snap election this autumn, but the party may not be so ready to offer their support in 2021.
Jessica Murphy there reporting from Toronto. And I suppose it's that time of the year, isn't it, James, where everybody's in each country, if you're in Africa, parts of Asia, you're rating how your politicians did in 2020 and probably hoping they may do a bit better in 2021.
You cynic.
Well, but that's, what people do, I suppose.
This is the BBC World Service, and here's what World Book Club have been reading.
Reykjavik has undergone a transformation. An ominous hush lies over the busiest.
I'm Harriet Gilbert, and we've been reading a novel published 7 years ago, but uncannily prophetic. A story of love and cinema set during the 1918 flu pandemic.
It was one of those rare moments in history where everything seems to happen at the same time.
The book's called Moonstone, The Boy Who Never Was, by the Icelandic author Sjón.
All of a sudden, this book mirrors the direct experience of people today.
Can you talk to us a little bit about how you prepared to write this book?
I thought it was a powerful and vibrant story.
Are you inspired by old movies?
What I've always tried to do in my writing is to acknowledge that reality exists on different levels for all of us.
World Book Club with Sjón, Sunday at 14 GMT.
Hello and welcome to Newsday from the BBC World Service with James and Rahul.
The UK is finally leaving the European single market. What will it mean for trade on the continent?
A Liberian minister responds to allegations about government inaction in a high-profile case of violence against an opposition politician.
And we'll hear the story of the architect and the flower aiming to bring hope in Italy. First though, this news.
BBC News. The Chinese authorities have given conditional approval for public use of a coronavirus vaccine developed by the firm Sinopharm. It's the first such backing for any Chinese vaccine. In July, China approved 3 different trial jabs for emergency use in key workers. The United States has set a new record for the number of coronavirus deaths registered in a single day, more than 3,900. The latest landmark was reported by Johns Hopkins University. Nearly 1,200 Brazilians have died with coronavirus in the past 24 hours. It's the highest daily figure since the beginning of September. The joint African Union and UN peacekeeping mission in the Sudanese region of Darfur comes to an end today after 13 years. Troops were deployed to protect civilians after mostly non-Arab communities rebelled against the government in Khartoum. Officials in Australia have warned against what they call coronavirus super-spreading events on New Year's Eve. The Premier of the state of New South Wales urged people in Sydney to start the new year off on a positive foot by respecting restrictions. People in Britain have also been asked to avoid New Year's Eve celebrations because of the fast-growing number of coronavirus cases. France is deploying 100,000 police and paramilitaries to break up parties. The US says it's imposing new trade tariffs on France and Germany weeks before a new administration takes over in Washington. They cover aircraft manufacturing parts and some alcohol products. Clashes between protesters and police on the Pan-American Highway in Peru have left at least 2 people dead. The clashes reportedly took place after police tried to clear the highway, blocked by farm labourers calling for improved pay and conditions. And Russian experts say a recently unearthed woolly rhinoceros is one of the best examples of an Ice Age animal yet discovered in Siberia. The rhino was revealed by the melting permafrost in northeastern Russia. BBC News.
Hello and welcome back to Newsday with James and Rahul. In the next half hour, Brexit, a deep dive into the search for the COVID vaccine and the flower symbolising hope for a post-pandemic world in Italy. And of course, we'll also be heading to Ghana and Liberia too. So let's get going.
More than 4 years after the Brexit vote, Britain is no longer part of the European Union. And at midnight tonight, a transitional period ends, and the UK will no longer be in the EU single market and customs union. So what will be the impact on the UK and the EU? The Irish MEP, Barry Andrews, is a member of the European Parliamentary Committee on International Trade and joins us now. Thank you very much indeed for talking to us on Newsday. What sort of immediate impact do you see?
Well, obviously, this is the first time in EU trading history that we have done an agreement that actually imposes trade barriers. And I don't think that has ever been done anywhere in trade agreements around the world. So it's very difficult to fully understand what the impact will be. And I think it will really depend on political will on both sides, rebuilding a relationship that was difficult in the first place, even during the 47 years of UK membership. So in the very short term, it will impact businesses because they will have to fill out things like export health certificates and customs declarations, and there will be delays at the borders. But politically, what can be done is that the rhetoric has to be dialed down. We have to take a medium to longer term approach to rebuilding EU-UK relationships.
Do you have much sense that that is happening, that dialing down of rhetoric?
No, and I was prepared to brush aside the triumphalism of the last few days on the basis that the UK Prime Minister wanted to get ratification through Westminster, which is fair enough. But if you look at the speech that Trade Secretary Liz Truss gave at Chatham House, I think in November, the characterisation of the EU was extremely negative. And I would think that if we are going to have a more mature relationship between the EU and the UK, it requires a much better understanding of each other's position. And at the moment, there is no clear indication of that. There were some words, yes, Prime Minister, which would indicate that he probably understands this as a basic requirement, because we have to remember this is a very thin deal. There are lots of parts of the economic and social relationship that were not able to be dealt with in the very short time available, and they will have to be dealt with over a period of 6 to 9 months. And that will depend on trust. It will depend on a strong political will to build that relationship.
So more negotiations ahead. I feel like I've said that before quite a few times over the last few years. One argument put forward by those in favour of Brexit in the UK is that Europe is actually pretty divided, or has the potential to be pretty divided on its approach to the UK, and that's something that can benefit Britain.
Well, I've never heard people make that argument, because, in fact, the exact opposite is true. The European Union has acted in a united way that many commentators say they have never seen before, in terms of its the mandate that was created for the negotiations with the UK, in terms of the last 4 years, and the support that was provided to Michel Barnier as the negotiator. It has demonstrated the value of EU membership to many skeptics. And if you look at the European Parliament elections that happened last year, the turnout was increased for the first time in about 40 years. So it really had the opposite effect. If there were those who thought it might lead to disunity in the European Union, it had the opposite effect. And that's not to paper over the disunity in the European Union on other issues, but on this issue, the member states were fully unified in the approach to the UK negotiations.
Barry Andrews, Irish MEP, talking to us live there. Thank you very much indeed. Now, as we enter a new year, much hope is being placed on the COVID-19 vaccines that are slowly being rolled out globally. As part of a special programme, the BBC World Service has had access to labs and trials around the world to find out how scientists have been able to create brand new vaccines in such a short space of time. Glyn Tansley reports.
Early December at the Chris Hani Baragwanath Hospital in Soweto, South Africa.
I feel fine because it doesn't do any harm to my body. My name is Tim Khwantleng. I'm at Bara at the trial vaccine for the COVID-19.
I'm Dr. Antoinette Kuhn, the principal investigator on the Chadox vaccine trial. This morning, what we are doing is we are seeing people for their follow-up visits. They present here for different protocol visits. Some of them would receive their second dose of vaccination this morning. Others are coming in for a safety checkup. And then we are also starting to see some of our participants for their 6 months follow-up.
COVID-19 is a disease that's touched all corners of the world. In order to find a solution, scientists can't be contained to labs and offices. They have to get out into communities to test their newly developed vaccines work, and they need to be in as many communities as possible.
My name is Janine. I lost a family member due to COVID-19, my grandfather's brother. So I just wanted to help if they can be able to find something that can prevent COVID-19. I just wanted to be part of that.
These participants are taking part in the trial for the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, also known here as Chadox-1. Dr. Sean Elias is a researcher at Oxford University.
The main things we're obviously interested in looking at is different age groups and obviously different populations. Now, there's different genetic makeup of different people all around the world, and your genetics can also have an effect on how susceptible you are to a disease. One of the things we've noticed with COVID is there's certain biases into who is most at risk of the virus. So particularly men are more susceptible than women, and individuals who are older are more susceptible than those who are younger. But we've also seen the virus can have a bigger impact on individuals from a black and ethnic minority background. And as a result, you need to assess your vaccine in different populations to make sure that it's safe first, but also effective, because in some populations it might not work as well as in others.
It's an enormous challenge to recruit enough people to take part, but the researchers and participants alike know just how important it is.
My mom was the one who was not sure about the study. She's just unsure because she's like, okay, what if you're going to contract the virus, stuff like that. So yeah, it was a bit of a concern at first.
If we can be able to find a vaccine, most of our elders can be much more safe.
Scientists in South Africa wanted to help Oxford to run their vaccine trials. In return, they get local data on how the vaccine works on people living here, which will help the country's regulators decide whether to approve the vaccine or not. Here's Professor Shabir Maddy, the principal investigator on 2 COVID vaccine trials in the country.
What is also nested in the study is enrollment of people living with HIV, and that is of particular importance in the context of South Africa, where close to 15 to 16% of the adult population are people living with HIV. So understanding the immune responses of the vaccine in that particular group of individuals relative to what is observed in people without HIV is also of particular interest to us in South Africa.
But Professor Maddy is worried because none of these vaccines come cheap. The South African government has begun to procure vaccines through a global system called COVAX, which aims to guarantee fair and equitable access to COVID vaccines around the world.
The model of the COVAX facility doesn't work in the interest of South Africa. And the reason for that is that South Africa is classified as an upper middle income country and is expected to pay the same sort of price as would be paid by high income countries. In terms of a country perspective, unfortunately, it would actually undermine our ability to gain access to adequate quantity of vaccine because the economy of the country is pretty much in the doldrums.
As a starting point, the South African government has now made a payment of $19 million to COVAX. That will secure access to vaccines for about 10% of the population.
You can hear more from the trials in Soweto, indeed more behind-the-scenes access to many of the COVID-19 vaccine trials on Breakthrough, the race for the COVID vaccine. That's a special documentary to be broadcast on New Year's Day here on the BBC World Service. Let's head to Ghana now, because the opposition has filed a petition in the Supreme Court to annul the results of this month's presidential elections. The opposition, National Democratic Congress, is citing irregularities. The incumbent president, Nana Akufo-Addo, was declared the winner by the country's electoral commission with just over 51% of the votes. That's ahead of the opposition leader and former president, John Mahama, who got 47.37%. To discuss this, we're now joined by the NDC Member of Parliament, Samuel Oketso-Ablakwa. Samuel, thank you so much for joining us here on Newsday. You filed this petition now. Why has it taken so long? The elections were on the 7th of December.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It is important to emphasize that per the Ghanaian constitution, we have 21 days after the declaration of results to file this petition. And we are well within the time. We filed yesterday, which is the last day of the 21 days.
Okay.
It is important to stress. It's important to stress.
It is important to stress, but can I ask you what evidence have you got for the claim that you're putting forward at the moment?
We have very, very ironclad evidence that the election was flawed. The declaration of results was fraught with discrepancies. The Ghanaian Constitution, Article 63.3, is very clear that one must obtain more than 50% of the total valid votes cast. It is our contention that nobody obtained that, and that the election should have gone into a runoff. And so the declaration of Nana Akufo-Addo as winner of the December 7, 2020 election is a declaration which cannot be sustained. It cannot be accepted.
There are others who disagree with you. The Electoral Commission, the Economic Community of West African States have all said that this was a free and fair election.
Even in all those reports, including the Economic Community of West African States report, the European Union Observer Mission report, they all highlighted the lack of transparency in the collation of the results. And we will tender evidence that the collation was not properly done. Indeed, there are many independent analysts who have already pointed out to many irregularities. The Electoral Commission itself has had to correct itself 6 times. At least 6 times they have been making amendments and making all kinds of corrections to the declaration they made on the 9th of December.
This is going to be a long process, though. If we go back to 2012, when there was a similar challenge, the courts looked at that for 8 months. So you're not going to get a verdict here very quickly, are you?
Yes, but there's been an improvement in this system, learning from what happened in 2012. So we expect that this particular petition should be decided on within a maximum period of 4 months. At least the Supreme Court has made that commitment publicly. And so we expect that within the next 4 months, we should have a determination of this suit.
Samuel Ablakwa there joining us from Ghana on the petition there that has been filed by the opposition. And of course, we will keep across that over the next few months here on Newsday.
This is Newsday on the BBC World Service with Rahul and James. A reminder of our top stories. China has approved its first coronavirus vaccine for general use. The United Nations is ending its peacekeeping mission in the Sudanese region of Darfur. We've had a text in from that by James Rui Majok in Bentiu Town, South Sudan. And he says the end of UNAMID, the peacekeeping mission, is something which will not be good for IDPs, displaced people, and those who are in the refugee camps in Chad. And another headline, Australians are preparing to welcome in the new year, have been warned not to attend coronavirus super-spreading events. Let's get the sports for James.
Now, Liverpool are going to end the year on top of the Premier League, but back-to-back draws against bottom half of the table opponents will have given their title rivals much hope for 2021. A combination of wasteful finishing and brilliant goalkeeping from the Newcastle goalkeeper saw Jurgen Klopp's side draw 0-0 at Newcastle.
We are not happy about the result, obviously,
but I can work with the performance. We put them really under pressure, played really good football, and yes, you cannot deny them completely. So they had moments, especially set pieces, not that many counter-attacks, but they for sure thought they would have more.
Liverpool are just 3 points above Manchester United, who have a game in hand. Tottenham's match against Fulham was postponed last night. It was meant to be taking place just before Liverpool played Newcastle because of COVID cases in the Fulham squad. The Premier League, though, insists that they have no plans to suspend the season. Now, in the NBA, Becky Hammon has become the first woman to direct a team in an NBA game, assistant at the San Antonio Spurs. She took over when the head coach, Greg Popovich, was ejected for arguing with officials during the Spurs game against the LA Lakers. We'll be taking a deeper look at this next hour. We want to hear more about it because it's awesome. Well, in the same game, the Lakers' LeBron James celebrated his 36th birthday with another landmark when he extended his streak of scoring 10 points or more in a game to 1,000 straight games as the Lakers won 121 points to 107. LeBron passed the record, which was held by Michael Jordan a couple of years ago. It was previously at 866. It's now 1,000. Incredible stuff. Elsewhere, Kenya's Peres Jeshep-Shahir, who regained the half-marathon world title in October, breaking her own world record in the process, has been speaking to the BBC World Service about the role that shoe technology is playing in the sport. A number of world records have fallen in the last couple of years on the roads and on the track as athletes have been cleared to wear running shoes that have a carbon fibre element, whether that's a plate or rods. Jeshep-Shahir told the BBC that first and foremost, it's the athlete's talent and dedication that leads to victories and fast times.
Shoe is not the one make you to run a record. Even me, if I give you my shoe, you wear it, you cannot run that record. Just the shoes can help something a little bit. I can say it's a little bit because I can say my Adidas shoe, what I feel is that I can feel the impact of the ground. That's the thing that helped me. And at a little bit push, you feel something, it's pushing a little bit. The shoe is not the one help to run a record or to win a gold, but it's your own effort.
I think I could do with a pair of those shoes. You can catch up with all the latest sports news and results on our website, bbc.com/sports.
Really not sure the shoes would be enough, James Gregg, but thank you.
That's not very kind, is it, on the last day of the year?
I'll be better next year.
Yeah, probably not. I don't think so, really. It'll be slower next year. Let's now head to Liberia, and as you may have heard on Newsday yesterday morning about the case of Ms. Bato Kane, an independent senatorial candidate who says that she and her team had to flee Barpolu County in the northern part of the country during recent elections after her supporters were harassed and physically assaulted. She's called for the UN to get involved because she says the government has not done anything to deal with this alleged attack. For a response now, we're joined by the Liberian Information Minister, Ledgerhood Rene. Ledgerhood, thank you for joining us here on Newsday. These are very serious allegations from Ms. Bato Kane and serious allegations about the fact that your government hasn't done anything about it.
Quite to the contrary, our government has launched a three-pronged investigation into these allegations and so the issue that emerged from Bapalu as a result of violence, electoral violence. Well, looking into these things, as I speak to you now, there are 10 Sierra Leoneans who have been arrested and have been charged and turned over to the local county authority for prosecution. That's one aspect of the investigation that has been done so far. The next one is the use of traditional methods by local county authorities, the allegations, and we've already gone into an investigation headed by...
So when are you expecting these investigations to conclude?
These investigations are about in their concluding stages, like I was saying to you.
So are we talking days, weeks?
Yeah, we're talking a matter of days. Already actions will be taken right after the festive season, I'm told, by those who carried out the investigations.
So, you've heard what Miss Kane has had to say. Do you here on Newsday condemn what's happened to her?
Oh, definitely. We were the first as a government to condemn the electoral violence that took place in northern Liberia. We're clear on that government has no interest in undermining its own democratic process. So yes, we highly condemned it, and that's why we're launching these investigations to bring to both those who were involved.
Ms. Cannon clearly, though, doesn't have faith in those investigations because she wants the UN to get involved here. Clearly that's not a good sign for your government.
Well, it's understandable under the circumstances, some of the things that happened, but we have no interest in shielding any individual. There are no sacred cows under these circumstances here for us. Ms. Cannon wants the United Nations to get involved. Fair enough for us. As a government, we have no interest in shielding anything. These actions were not sanctioned by us. So obviously we're open to any kind of investigation that she wants or anybody wants, for the matter of fact. But we will do our best as a government to ensure that we restore calm and security to the area and make sure that the elections are held.
Yeah, and when do you expect that to happen? Because, that whole process is currently suspended.
Well, that is left now with the electoral body, but our efforts, especially as the executive, is to restore calm, which we've done already, and we're working with local authorities now to make sure that everyone feels secure to return to the ballot box.
Ledger Hood Rennie, thank you so much for joining us here on Newsday.
Now, finally this hour, we're going to talk about a man called Stefano Boeri, an Italian architect renowned for creating vertical forests on high-rise buildings, bringing the natural world to our urban centres. He was contacted by the Italian government to help the COVID-19 vaccination rollout, and he's been telling me why.
The request came from the Italian Special Commissioner for the COVID-19 emergency. They asked me to conceive and develop an architectural and communicative concept behind the anti-COVID-19 vaccination campaign.
So the idea was what? To show how a vaccine can bring hope, to take people into a different sort of environment at this key moment in the fight against the pandemic?
Yes, absolutely. We really believe that the association of the vaccination campaign with the flower, with the natural cycle of life, continuous rebirth, could become the right message. We really wanted to exclude antagonistic images that could promote anxiety, and at the same time be careful not to promote the notion that the vaccine would set you totally free. So the idea of a primrose or the flower could perfectly, let's say, answer to the request of the Italian government.
As I understand it, then, people will get vaccinated in some cases in sort of pavilions set up to look like a primrose or decorated with primroses. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So for sure, people will be vaccinated in hospitals, in empty gyms and other spaces like that. But we will need also a certain number of new pavilions. And our idea is to create this new pavilion with the shape of a primrose. And we have designed them in order to be easily disassembled and reassembled. So the idea that they will become the temporary structure for any future emergency in Italy.
The metaphor, the idea you want to convey is obviously important. Also the precise flower, because I understand some other flowers you might have considered a link to particular political parties in Italy.
Yes. In Italy, the flowers have been used by politics, so we had to exclude possible association. But the idea of primrose was, in a way, also generated by the fact that primrose is the first flower to blossom after a long and dark winter. So I think it's a very efficient metaphor of what is going to happen.
It has been a long and dark winter for Italy. How has it changed you, your family, the communities you're part of?
Well, I'm based in Milano, and Milano was, during the first lockdown, one of the cities where by the pandemics we had a lot of victims, and I was also personally touched by this tragedy. I think we need a message of hope, and the idea of a flower, it was for me the best way to communicate this perspective of rebirth.
Do you think once that rebirth happens, the pandemic will have a lasting impact on cities, on urban planning, because people are using cities in such a different way now, working from home maybe, or the idea of outside space being so much more important?
Well, I'm sure that So not in terms of a revolution, but in terms of acceleration of processes that were already ongoing in our cities. So the awareness that we can work at home, the, let's say, necessity to imagine a city that will be founded on a system, let's say, on an archipelago of a self-sufficient district, where in 15, 20 minutes you can find everything you need instead of, let's say, taking a car and spending 3-4 hours moving days. So I think that all these processes were already present before the pandemic. Now they are basically so urgent that the central target of what we have to do in our cities. So for sure, it will change a lot, and we have to do our best to make this real.
Stefano Boeri calling then for long-term changes in the way we think about our cities, the way we plan our cities. Of course, he's an architect who does that sort of work, so he might well do that. But I think there's probably something in that, isn't there, that we're rethinking the way our urban spaces should be?
Yeah, I wonder, it's an interesting conversation, isn't it? Because are we rethinking it in different parts of the world? You know, I spend a lot of time in Asia, you spend a lot of time in Africa. I don't think in India people are rethinking cities. In fact, maybe the other way around, we're going to see a greater increase of people moving from rural areas to urban areas. I don't know what that's like in Africa.
Yeah. I mean, it depends where you go, of course. But yeah, the pressure in places like Lagos and so on. I think a lot of those sort of West African capital cities built on the coast, Conakry, Dakar, and then you get this influx of people.
Yeah.
Lagos to Abidjan, and then where do those people
So maybe
go?
not so different there. But, you know, fascinating interview, and really worth people going and checking out some of those buildings of his. They're extraordinary.
Yeah, the sort of vegetation growing up the buildings, sucking the carbon dioxide out of the air. That's the idea. And then these pavilions for this COVID-19 vaccination rollout and primrose regeneration. It's a hopeful image.
Yeah, that's what we need, don't we? We're heading to 2021. We need some hope, really, don't we?
This is Newsday.
This is the BBC World Service, where our new series of presidential profiles starts with Donald Trump.
He had monumental ambition at a very early age.
He's so desperate to be admired, it's quite easy to manipulate him.
Losing is never easy. Not for me, it's not.
They underestimate him over and over and over again.
Presidential profiles of Donald Trump, Tuesday at 9:20 GMT. And in an hour, this week's inquiry.
There's a problem in education, and it's probably not one you expect. Around the world, from schools to universities, boys are trailing girls in their academic performance. Join me, David Grossman, as we examine what's going on and how to fix it.
Next, it's Newsday, here on the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Hello and welcome to Newsday on New Year's Eve here on the BBC World Service with Rahul Tandon and James Copnell.
Coming up, Brexit, our main story. Big deadline day. Britain no longer part of the single market, and freedom of movement ending too. We look at what it means for Britons wanting to live in Europe and the 3 million EU citizens currently living in the UK.
Today also marks the end of UNAMID, the international peacekeeping
going clinical trials.